Panel B is titled LGBTQ plus collections and context, the politics of representation. Stephanie Yuhl will be moderating this session. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Does it sound all right? Great. So I just want to say thank you and echo the other presenters' comments about this conference. It's really a delight to be able to connect professionally with folks in this time when we're otherwise isolated. So thank you so much. And my name is Stephanie Yuhl, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a professor of history at the College of the Holy Cross, your ersatz host for this event. And today we're having this conversation about LGBTQ plus collections in context. There are 4 of us on this panel. We envision this very much as a conversation. So I'm excited we have a little extra time, and we're going to be quick. What we're going to do is each of us is going to introduce ourselves and our projects in about a 5-minute slideshow. Hats off to Andrew Elder, one of our panelists, who's going to be the slide master. He's going to be passing the slides forward for all of us to see. And then we're going to run through a couple different kinds of questions for our conversation. And then we're going to move on to hopefully a robust 25-minute conversation with you, the conference participants. So please go ahead and share your questions with Sonia so we can have that conversation. So Andrew, would you like to forward the slide and we can get started? So I'll introduce myself, and we've chosen to do this with the following question: what does LGBTQ plus collection building, outreach, and digitization look like at your institution? Big question. We're each going to take a few minutes to answer that. My institutions are 2. One is the College of the Holy Cross, where I'm a professor of history, and the other is the Worcester Historical Museum, located in Worcester, Mass, here in central Massachusetts. And the Scholarship in Action logo that you see there is through the College of the Holy Cross, which funded in a very generous way this work in our community to build LGBTQ collections at the Worcester Historical Museum. It itself is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. You can forward the slide. The project is called LGBTQ plus Worcester for the Record, and we are just about 2-year-old project that looked at our collections at the museum and built upon a 1993 donation of documents from an organization called the Gay and Lesbian Coalition of Central Massachusetts in 1993. Not much, unfortunately, had happened after that point in terms of building LGBTQ history. And so a couple of years ago, we got together a group of scholars, myself, Joseph Cullen from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and Bob Tobin, a professor of literature and German at Clark University, working with the wonderful staff at the Worcester Historical Museum, and decided that how could we cultivate this collection and really help to engage and empower local LGBTQ communities through collections. So our model was very much a shared authority model of public history, trying to create a platform for self-empowerment and self-direction. We had a terrific community advisory board. When we get into the nuts and bolts, maybe in the discussion portion of today, I can talk a little bit about some of the really strong challenges that we encountered. It's entirely voluntary, and certainly representation and inclusivity were a challenge to that. But nonetheless, we had a terrific advisory board that helped us to network within the community and develop community partnerships with organizations such as the LGBT Asylum Task Force in Worcester, AIDS Project Worcester, Safe Homes, etc. This is an image here of the Gay and Lesbian Latino organization, GAJO, and some of the objects that Leo Negron Cruz donated out of his personal collection to our archive. You can forward the slide, please. We built on this collection, and one of the ways we did that most was really a hustle. This has been and continues to be a hustle in the community. Community discovery days where we would open the museum. Here we have a donation from a young gentleman who was the founder of the queer youth prom in Worcester, and these are their artifacts, their mermaid vest and rainbow Angora jacket and crown, not tiara, but crown, that they wore at the prom. They very graciously gave that to us not to keep in the collection, but rather to take photographs of, scan, and also to include in our eventual exhibit. The image here is from Gloria Audette, who is a mid-80s lesbian, lives in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, with whom we did an oral history. And this is an image of her in Paris Island, South Carolina, with her platoon before she is, in 1956, kicked out of the Marines and discharged because they discovered letters from a lover to her. And so under the Lavender Scare, Gloria was kicked out of the Marines. So these are just some examples of some of the objects and artifacts and documents that we've been able to solicit from the community, and that the community has been generous enough to share with us. You can forward the slide, Andrew. The other real mainstay of this project, because we're really in the building stage, is an oral history project. These are just some examples of interviews that we have done with over 25 members of the LGBTQ plus Worcester County community. It's not just the city, but the county that we're trying to reach out to. The oral histories have been a remarkable space because of the nature of published sources during this period, which is really sort of 1945 forward, either negatively characterizing LGBTQ communities and people, or being full of silences. So it's been incredibly important to create trust within the community so individuals can feel comfortable sharing their stories. And of course, the most important part of that is the accessibility question around transcription and editing of those oral interviews. You can fast forward one more. Then the final thing that I want to leave with you is that since we're in the building stage and we have started digitizing, Professor Joe Cullen at WPI is our digital curator. He has put up on the web under lgbtqinthewoo.org an Ameka site with over 800 items, 14 different collections from the community. And really our centerpiece for the first part of this project was this exhibit that was at the Worcester Historical Museum. We saw it as an invitation and a provocation to the community to come to share, because of course community members are the people who own these stories, and we are very grateful for them. We also created a catalog, really a book out of this exhibit that you can all get if you wish through the shop at the Worcester Historical Museum. It's pretty terrific. We have this ongoing digitization project and questions around what is the appropriate role for professional formal archival intervention in a community-built archive. So that's something I'd be curious to learn more from this community. So I thank you so much, and I'm going to pass the baton now to Andrew, who will introduce himself and his project.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Elder. I'm a volunteer archivist with the History Project. I've been there as a volunteer archivist since 2006. And I'm currently the chair of the organization's board of directors. By day, I'm the interim university archivist at the Healy Library at UMass Boston. So the History Project is a nonprofit community archives that was founded in 1980 by a group of activists, archivists, and historians. From the start, the History Project's mission was to collect materials documenting LGBTQ life in the Boston area and to share those stories with our community and the broader public. In the ensuing years, the group compiled slideshows on queer history that were shown in bars and on college campuses, among other venues. In 1996, the History Project received a major boost in visibility when the organization's exhibition on pre-Stonewall queer history, called Public Faces, Private Lives, opened at the Boston Public Library. The exhibition broke attendance records at the library at the time and became the best-selling book in Proper Bostonians, Lesbian and Gay History from the Puritans to Playland. Since the 90s, the History Project has produced exhibitions on different aspects of Boston's queer history, including exhibitions on queer communities of color, photojournalism, queer youth, and most recently, an interactive online map in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising in New York City. The History Project has been collecting material since the early 1980s, but really began focusing on collection building after the exhibition at the Boston Public Library. Today, our archives includes nearly 200 collections from organizations and individuals, and ranges from the records of early gay liberation organizations to photographs of pre-Stonewall Boston, to objects such as t-shirts and buttons and trophies, materials documenting the marriage equality movement, and stories of our community's response to HIV and AIDS. We have an extensive publications collection as well, with runs, Boston-based publications like Gay Community News, Bay Windows, Bad Attitude, and Fag Rag, as well as bar rags like Esplanade Next and Tommy's Connection. So we are led by a board of directors and a full-time executive director, which is actually exciting news. And until this year, the History Project has been an entirely volunteer-run organization, except for the hiring of occasional part-time staff to work on special projects and grants. So this past January, we received a 2-year support for community archives grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to hire our first executive director. The History Project's Archives and Research Committee is responsible for building our archival collections, processing those materials, and making them available to the public. Even with an executive director now, most of this work is carried out by volunteers. And processing and digitization work can take a lot longer to carry out than at other larger institutions. Volunteers are, you have to remember, volunteers are doing this work in their free time, in the evenings and on weekends, often 1 or 2 hour chunks of time. And as far as digitization goes, the committee has overseen several digitization projects in the past few years, including digitization and description of recordings from Boston's Other Voice, an LGBTQ themed radio program that ran from 1981 to 1989 and features dozens of interviews with community members about their work and their lives. And then the digitization of the Robert John Quinn Memorial Books, which includes obituaries of more than 7,000 individuals, most of whom died of HIV and AIDS. Most recently, volunteers have been working on digitizing materials related to two early LGBTQ organizations in the Boston area, the Homophile Union of Boston and the Boston chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis. So as I mentioned, our mission is twofold: to document and preserve Boston's queer history and to share that history with our community and the general public. Volunteers on our events and outreach committee work to create spaces where community members can come together around our history. And our various outreach activities include Out of the Archives, a monthly series of public talks focused on our archival collections, the History Maker Awards, which honor established and emerging activists, Into the Streets, which is our walking tours program, and out in public events such as film screenings, lectures, and exhibitions, often produced and developed in partnership with other area organizations. And then lastly, in the time of COVID-19, the events committee is also working now on developing program that can happen remotely, like with virtual film screenings, book readings, lectures, and discussion groups. A couple of weeks ago, the History Project launched #QueerArchivesAtHome, a crowdsourced digital archives of pictures, videos, and stories designed to bring our community together during this time of social distancing. So that's what I wanted to kind of go over, and you can learn more about us at historyproject.org, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks. Next up, I believe, is Laura.
Thank you, Andrew and Stephanie, for your presentations. So I'm Laura Peimer, and I have been an archivist at the Schlesinger Library since 2008, where I process a wide range of collections, including LGBTQ collections. And I've presented and published about my work as well. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge my colleagues who contributed their knowledge and insights to what I will be sharing at today's panel. Specifically, Faculty Director Jane Kamensky, Archivist for Digital Collections Amy Benson and Jen Weintraub, Curator Ken V. Phillips, and Archivist Jenny Gottwald. The Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America dates its origins to 1943, when alumna Maud Wood Park donated her collection of materials related to women's suffrage. Her women's rights collection became the nucleus of the research library. When second wave feminism surged in the 1960s and 70s, the library's collections grew very rapidly. Our LGBTQ related holdings include the papers of lesbian and bisexual feminists, transgender activists, and advocacy organizations. We are interested in adding collections that further document the civil rights activism of LGBTQ people, as well as their experiences in family and private life. Next slide, please. The library is particularly interested in collections that provide a more complete account of the many facets and presentations of gender. And we are seeking collections whose creators self-identify as trans, or whose lives and experiences fit within a definition of transgender. Our faculty director, Jane Kamensky, has stated that one of our goals is to collect materials that reflect the world today, including the tendency to push back against labels and rethink gender. We want to document current thought, scholarship, and debates about gender and terminology. For some, this broad focus goes well beyond, quote, the history of women in America. And Jane has remarked, at least on one occasion, that the only non-problematic word in our title is the. Case in point, some years ago, we contacted the creators of a Women Transitioning to Men blog in an effort to archive their digital content at the Schlesinger, and they declined, citing they did not want to be part of a library on the history of women. As a large special collections archive in a rich university, the Schlesinger does have funding and staff to acquire collections and process and digitize them. But we are both blessed and saddled with the Harvard name, as Jane Kelly in the last panel also noted. Harvard offers the appeal of status and visibility for some potential donors, but for others, the name Harvard, with its reputation for elitism and history of conservatism, can also work against the acquisition of new collections. Right now, the library is acquiring LGBTQ collections largely through individual staff efforts and networking, as well as by unsolicited donations. We are fortunate enough to have curatorial and archive staff, directors, and library council members who play a significant role in reaching out to communities, sometimes through conferences, events, or just contacting individuals with the hope of fostering relationships and stewarding gifts. Some recent acquisitions include the papers of writer, trans activist, and scholar Jennifer Finney Boylan, which we acquired through the efforts of one of our library council board members. Next slide, please. In 2018, Kelly Cogswell and Anna Simo, both former members of the direct action lesbian rights group, the Lesbian Avengers, donated their papers. The acquisition of this collection was a 9-year effort by our curator, who contacted Cogswell as a cold call back in 2009, specifically expressing interest in the records of the Lesbian Avengers. Through the outreach efforts of our faculty director, we also received the family papers of Jill Soloway, the comedian and television writer of the Amazon series Transparent. The library is aware of the wide-ranging collecting landscape in the area of LGBTQ archives. Many other repositories are also doing this work, particularly community-based archives that are vital and necessary and compensate for a history of institutional neglect of LGBTQ history in mainstream archives. Next slide. The Schlesinger is striving to be appropriate and collaborative with these and other institutions collecting LGBTQ materials. Taking advantage of the fact that the library is well-resourced and well-known in the research community, the Schlesinger has been exploring opportunities for partnerships with underfunded archives and exploring post-custodial collecting. We are interested in developing relationships with record creators and repositories where materials do not physically come to the Schlesinger, but where we offer some type of support with processing or digitization. We have made efforts in this area related to African American women's collections. For example, recently we partnered with Spelman College Archive and digitized a run of their copies of the African American women's periodical Sage. We continue to look for similar opportunities, partnership opportunities with LGBTQ repositories. Our digitization program is very active and plays a major role in the library's goal to improve access to our collections in order to encourage further and different uses of the collections. Some examples of our digitized LGBTQ content include photographs of transgender gatherings and events from the Ari Kane papers, photographs of LGBTQ rallies and protests by photographer Betty Lane. Next slide, please. And a small selection of poetry readings, interviews, and photographs from the Pat Parker papers, as well as a run of By Women, the newsletter of the Boston Bisexual Women's Network. Digitization is a way to fulfill an objective of our library, which is to ensure that women's history and the history of gender and sexuality is visible and accessible. Once again, we are fortunate to be able to access funding and resources to pursue a robust digitization program, and we have Harvard systems in place to provide access and preservation. But we are also providing access beyond Harvard, participating on other online platforms in order to make our collections more visible and to find new audiences. For LGBTQ collections, we have been adding content to the Digital Transgender Archive for some years now. And next fiscal year, we will be adding digitized images of many of our LGBTQ t-shirts to the site Wearing Gay History. WearingGayHistory.com began as a graduate student program project at George Mason University in 2014, and in a few years expanded to include images of LGBTQ t-shirts from collections around the world. Because online access is important for the library, we are willing to take some risks, particularly related to copyright, in putting materials online in order to ensure that visibility. A lot of our LGBTQ material is 20th century and under copyright, so often we rely on a takedown policy if we decide to post copyrighted content. In addition to copyright, there are sometimes restrictions added by the donor, as well as privacy issues, particularly third-party privacy concerns. This can limit what we digitize or how we present content online. Every time a digitization project is proposed, we need to assess any risks related to scanning and putting materials online. We take into consideration the age of materials, the state of the community, and ask the question, what are we actually exposing? There are many possible outcomes between digitize everything to we can't make anything available, keeping in mind that the internet has changed the parameters of the conversation. So this was just a brief overview regarding the library's efforts to acquire and make available LGBTQ collections. Our approaches to collecting, outreach, and digitizing all support our mission to preserve and make available collections related to gender, sexuality, and informs our priorities moving forward. Thank you. So next up is KJ.
All right, thank you, Laura and Andrew and Stephanie. My name is KJ Rawson. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm an associate professor of English at the College of the Holy Cross, and I'm also the founder and director of the Digital Transgender Archive. You can find us on social media with at Digital Trans Arc if you're interested. So in order to answer this really quite large question, I'm really going to provide a 5-minute, very quick overview of the project and give you a sense of not only what we have on the site, but how it gets there. Next slide, please. So this is the top of our homepage if you haven't ever been there before. The project is at digitaltransgenderarchive.net. And the purpose of the project is really to increase the accessibility of transgender-related history. There's a lot of barriers that make research in this area quite difficult to find. And so we're trying to take down some of those barriers and make it much, much easier for people to conduct research in this area. So the project was launched in January of 2016, and we now have 61 contributing institutions, which come from 9 different countries. So the project is based at Holy Cross, but we don't actually have any physical materials on site. Instead, ours is a digital collaboration among all of these different institutions, which are spread out really far and wide. Our digitization process is really adaptable based on who it is we're working with and what their needs are. So we do have a lab at the College of the Holy Cross, and sometimes we get materials sent to us and we digitize them on our location, and then we send them out to an archives for permanent archival storage. And then we also do some work where we travel to our archival partners and do digitization on site. Sometimes, as Laura mentioned, there are well-resourced collaborators that we work with who are able to do all that digitization work themselves, and then we just link out to their materials. And then in some cases, we actually take materials and send them out to a professional digitization service. So we have all of these different options which work better for some institutions than others, and we try to adapt that process based on who we're working with. To date, we have a little under 8,500 items available online, and our collection is made up of both digitized primary source materials as well as information on archival holdings. So we have discovery resources, so things like finding aids, collection guides, information on all of those collections that we have not digitized, because of course what we have on the site is just such a small fraction of trans history that's already been collected. Our materials date from the 16th century to the present, but it's a bit misleading because really the majority is from the second half of the 20th century. So next slide, please. All right, so our scope. I'm actually going to read this scope statement because it's a really important part of how we decide what to include in the project. The DTA uses the term transgender to refer to a broad and inclusive range of non-normative gender practices. We treat transgender as a practice rather than an identity category in order to bring together a trans historical and transcultural collection of materials related to transing gender. We collect materials from anywhere in the world with a focus on materials created before the year 2000. Now, whenever I say that we focus on materials created before the year 2000, archivists tend to laugh at me because why would we limit it based on 20 years? And then in my defense, I say, we really try to focus our resources on pre-1990s because that 10 years makes a big difference. But there is an actual justification for it. And the reason for it is that the term transgender really started to gain widespread traction, particularly in the US, around 1990. And that was also at the time when internet usage, particularly in the home, became more ubiquitous and more accessible for many in the United States again. And so what that means is that in terms of providing access to trans-related historical records and community formation and that kind of work, we really wanted to focus on things that were happening before the widespread usage of the term transgender and the widespread usage of the internet. So we shifted away from transgender as an identity term, because if we only collected materials related to those who identify as transgender, we would have a very, very limited range of materials we could include. So instead, we really treat transgender as a practice by thinking through what normative gender practices are in the cultural context that we are looking at, and then trying to determine whether that fits our scope. This is really helpful, particularly on a global scale, because of course, in many places throughout the world, gender and sexuality are not completely separate things, right? They're a singular, conflated identity. And so we cannot just try to take our concept of transgender and force it throughout the world, right? So we try to use it in as capacious a way as possible. So that's a very quick introduction to the DTA. And I think I'll stop there so we have plenty of time to have our discussion.
Okay, so Andrew, if you want to forward, we had discussed as a panel that all four of us would be present during this conversation so that we can make this more of a discussion format. Thank you all so much for your introductions. And I will ask the first question to my colleagues, which is, how does your archive connect with the LGBTQ community? Some of you have already started that, but if you could elaborate on particular strategies.
I can start. So archivists who are processing collections communicate with the creator donor one-on-one during the processing of their collections. We often have them review finding aids, they go over the biographical note, they tell us what pronouns they prefer. And then we sometimes end up being the point person for them for future contact, if they want to send more addenda, things like that. On the curatorial side, I've already mentioned some aspects of community outreach that the library as a whole engages in. I'd like to mention another example which relates to the efforts of our curator, Kenby Phillips, who specifically focuses on acquiring collections that diversify our holdings. Kenvy's currently working on initiating a local conversations outreach program to various communities to talk about archiving and preservation. Her target audience for this program right now are Asian American communities. And of course, this includes LGBTQ identified individuals. One of the leaders in the advisory group of scholars she's working with right now is Helen Zia, who is a Chinese American journalist and an activist for Asian American and LGBTQ rights. There's also programming Radcliffe Institute-wide, which brings LGBTQ activists and other public figures on sites for events and conferences. Two quick examples, back in 2016 at our gender conference, author and trans advocate Janet Mock was a featured speaker at the annual conference. And last year at the gender conference, they explored gender and the aesthetics of communication, where the opening session included artists and audience members exploring questions of gender performance and identity. So there are multiple levels of outreach throughout the library and the Institute.
I can talk about the History Project. It's actually, I think we're in this interesting spot where we're an LGBTQ organization. We have we see ourselves as an organization as part of a social justice movement, but also we're also made up of, LGBTQ folks and allies. So I think as far as collection building, that in some ways makes our jobs a lot easier because we are part of the community that we're documenting. So, we have, somebody's friend will be retiring from an organization and we're like, oh, you're retiring from that organization. So these things happen because you're part of the community. But also this can introduce unique challenges because of course, we're not completely representative of every person in a community or every a very diverse community like LGBTQ community is. So we have to be a lot more intentional about making sure that our blind spots as individuals don't end and our biases as individuals don't kind of make it into the collecting practices of the organization or prevent us from doing outreach to kind of to our community in a broader way. So I think it's helpful, and it makes our jobs a lot easier when it comes to collection building, and when we do outreach programming as well, like the Queer Archives at Home project that I mentioned that we launched a couple weeks ago. I mean, it was pretty quick for us to be able to kind of share that with a community because it was, we're kind of part of the Boston community that we're documenting. So it's helpful, but also makes our jobs more complicated, and we have to be a lot, I think, more careful in some ways than an institution that's not doesn't have an LGBTQ mission or membership.
So I think I can build on Andrew's comment. There are also specific challenges to being part of an institution that doesn't have an LGBTQ mission and extensible content. The Worcester Historical Museum has been historically a much more traditional organization. This project is part of the museum's multi-decade efforts to reach out to new audiences and to collect the city and the county's history in a more sort of social history manner, in a more representative manner. So what that means, though, is that you both, as Andrew mentioned, you create this sort of a network of community members and allies, but because it's voluntary and because communities have sort of natural historians or people who, from their sense of privilege, feel that they can tell the story and have the objects of the story, you can tend to get a kind of skewing of materials from certain kinds of subcategories. I joked on our committee that, this would have all been gay male bars given the opportunity, because this is where a lot of the public material exists out of that white male space of privilege, even within the LGBTQ umbrella. So it's been a real challenge. Diversity and inclusion has been a real challenge. It's been a challenge in terms of what's the relationship of allies to the project. I would also say one of the other big challenges for us is that we are in central Massachusetts. It's a mid-sized city, second largest in New England, but what does that mean really? And Worcester has a very interesting conservative background. It was the hotspot for the John Birch Society, very strong Catholic working class historical roots, so that this kind of history is something that was largely closeted and repressed and vilified. And so creating trust within the community and from different kind of populations to be willing to share their experiences, it's a serious challenge. So we're a young organization, a young mission, 2 years old, and we've been surprised at how generous the community's been, but we also have had to hustle because we don't have the institutional pull of, let's say, Radcliffe or the size of a city like Boston, where there's a strong community. So we've really had to hustle and put ourselves at our little table with our little handouts and our smiles and our pins everywhere. Gone to Q-Flix and Pride and have reached out to the Rainbow Elder Network lunches and youth lunches and dinners, and we have just tried to show up. And the more you show up, the more people get to know you, and then the more people will come. But I think there's a real grassroots ground game for this kind of project, where if you build it, they won't necessarily come. You need to go out into the community and do a lot of work. We've also done programming and lectures. We had Eric Marcus come. Eric and Zaba from We're in Gay History. Actually, Laura gave a presentation at the museum. We've done tried to make the museum a space for the community, but it's still a hustle. So for all those smaller organizations out there in smaller communities, it is about getting out into the community and not expecting the community to come to you. Excuse my dog barking.
I'll just quickly add to that because I know we have other discussion questions to go on to, but I'll just quickly add that one of the really important parts of this too that I've experienced is having to convince many folks in LGBTQ communities that their histories are worth collecting and that they are important, and that these are things that people want, that researchers want to be able to work with and to see. And so that can be an additional barrier for many folks in LGBTQ communities who may not necessarily see their materials as worthwhile and as worth archiving. So that's been a really important part of my job that I hadn't actually anticipated before going into it.
Okay, thank you, KJ and Laura and Andrew. Let's move on to the next question here. How does the inclusion in online archival resources such as the DPLA and Digital Commonwealth affect accessibility and context for LGBTQ plus records? Who would like to take that?
Maybe I'll start again. So, well, I've already mentioned that Harvard has systems where we provide online access to materials. But we are also reaching out beyond Harvard to get our collections out there and to find new audiences, like the DTA and We're in Gay History. But when I was thinking about this question, and I was thinking of some challenges or things to consider related to delivering LGBTQ content on collaborative sites, and some ideas or thoughts that came to mind were, what guidelines do these collaborative sites advocate as it relates to describing LGBTQ materials? And do those guidelines fall in line with those of your own institution? If only certain items from a larger collection are being selected for inclusion on these sites, the individual items can potentially lose meaningful context, either on the folder level or collection level outside of other material related to it. So this could be a consideration to think about when determining what items to include. Sites such as Digital Commonwealth strongly recommend the use of controlled vocabularies to enhance searching and data consistency. Data consistency is important, but also potentially limiting if you want ways to not only use controlled terms, but also creator-supplied terminology. There can be issues of consistency and subjectivity depending on how many people are involved in creating metadata for these sites. Is the metadata harvested from the home institution or created by outside staff? And who is making the decision on using some search terms over others? When materials are available online this way, access and use is not mediated by a public services archivist or librarian who could potentially help deconstruct issues related to controlled vocabularies or help decipher what search terms to use or aid with description and access. And finally, how much is the creator of the records on board with providing access to items in their collections in this way? If someone's materials are getting digitized and being made available on various sites, they should ideally be aware of this, and any concerns they might have would need to be addressed.
So I'll actually jump in here a bit. So we've gone through a lot of the same concerns that Laura has mentioned, and really trying to think through what happens when our collections move throughout all of these various collections and our access from these different points of entry. And one of the things that really has struck me as a challenge is because our scope statement is so carefully crafted, where we move away from transgender as an identity to transgender as a practice, we can't control that, of course. I mean, even on our own site, but especially as our materials circulate more broadly, I have found in so many cases, researchers or media taking materials from our site and then pointing and saying, hey, look, that's a transgender person. Or this is an example of transgender community, when in actuality, we're not collecting it under that scope and under those auspices. And so it can be really challenging when you cannot always control the narrative as it circulates and as researchers are accessing it from these other places. But what it also means is that, thinking about some of Evan's comments from earlier, the more that we can add to record level context, the more that the possibility is for that information to travel with those records, with those items that will be accessed from these other digital spaces.
Andrew, did you want to add to that, or shall we move on to the next question?
I guess the one thing I would like to add, I like everything people have said makes so much sense to me. The thing that this makes me think about is, so the History Project as this standalone nonprofit, I think something I wonder about is we have a hosted instance of Omeka, and we use that because we can have some control over it, and we can kind of point our members to that. And also because I'm wondering about like inclusion in places like Digital Commonwealth, and DPLA, which I know we're excited to do. I'm wondering how that will kind of impact the case we make to our donors, because I mentioned all these things that we do, and the third thing that we have to do is to raise funds to do all the stuff that we have to do. We don't have an institution to kind of turn to. I mean, it's not all institutions are enormous, but like our institution in a way is the LGBTQ community that we serve, which is of course a really complex community. So, it's something I'm kind of thinking about. I'm excited to open our materials up to harvesting, but it is also something I'm kind of curious how other small community archives have kind of navigated that.
Okay. All right, so we'll be really important question that actually builds on what we were just talking about accessibility and controlling the narrative, which of course there's no control of the narrative, right, in research, but that concern about how materials are understood. The creation of metadata requires interpretation and labeling, and it can be a highly subjective and political act, says the DTA website. And we know that archives are a form of power and have a lot of subjectivity in the organizing and selection of materials. So for our panelists, how have you navigated the complexities of metadata creation in LGBTQ plus records? And if you have a specific example, I think that would be helpful to the participants.
I can jump in here. I want to first say that I did not technically write this question, though this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and the DTA is very passionate about and intervening and helping to kind of push conversations around. So I included a little logo here from the Homosaurus, which is a project that I'm involved in. And this actually in many ways came about, the regrowth of the Homosaurus came about in response to challenges that I experienced in trying to describe materials for the DTA. So the Library of Congress subject headings, as many of you know, have limited options for describing queer resources. And so when I came up against that challenge time and time again, I went to the LGBTQ library and information professional communities to say, all right, what other options are there out there? How can we describe these materials more authentically in ways that are closer to what the resources are about, and also in ways that are less offensive, right? And that we can help to control the narrative a little bit more and to make these more accessible, especially to contemporary researchers using this language. So I found out about the Homosaurus, which had been an LGBTQ specific vocabulary that was developed out of Amsterdam. And it was developed in the 80s and kind of got dusted off again in the 90s, and then was kind of quiet for a while. And then we, in the process of using it for the DTA, decided to transform it into a linked data vocabulary. And so now it is widely available. You can use it as processing materials in MARC. And what we're trying to do with that project, you can go to the site, you'll see it's not a very shiny, well-designed site, because the purpose is really about function. But it's a community-based project. It's international in scope, that we try to develop our own subject term vocabulary in order to better describe queer resources and make those resources more discoverable. So again, major plug for that project, but also I think it's a testament to the ways that sometimes we need to build our own resources when we come across these kinds of problems. And this was a really significant problem in trying to describe historical materials.
Anyone else want to speak to the metadata question?
I would like to talk a little bit about how we've been dealing with terminology and identity at the library. It's particularly with donor-created identities that don't fit neatly with the terminology used in popular standardized vocabularies like Library of Congress, as KJ mentioned as well. Hopefully this will not only show the limitations of these vocabularies, it'll also show how at the library we're trying to strike a balance between supporting LGBTQ visibility in our collections while respecting and being true to a creator's self-identity. So I'm going to do 3 examples. I'll try to fly through them pretty quick. So the papers of Jean Wolfe. Jean Wolfe was a physical ed teacher and an artist who lived from 1925 to 1997. And she had relationships with women, but did not describe herself as lesbian. Her preferred identity was mid-century gentleman butch. The archivist who processed the collection in 2011 decided to use the term lesbian in the subject heading in order to help researchers locate the collection, and she used Jean Wolfe's preferred identity in the biographical note. The archivist couldn't contact Wolfe for more information regarding her identity, but approached it by allowing Wolfe's voice to come through in the narrative biographical note while adding a subject term that would be helpful to current researchers. Another example is Mark Ethan Smith, who was born Marcia Ellen Smith in 1940 and legally changed his name in 1981. He did not identify as transgender and preferred the term biological female who lives as a person without regard to sex, and preferred the male pronoun he. While researchers interested in transgender-related topics would find his life and identity relevant, I believe, he did not refer himself as transgender. So when I processed the collection in 2012, I added his identity and the language he prefers, and I did not add transgender as a subject heading. I only added the Library of Congress term gender identity as a subject heading, knowing how Mark Smith felt about being identified as trans. To help researchers find the collection, though, it is included in our LGBTQ research guide. In this case, Smith was around and I was able to talk to him about the finding aid. He was able to review the bio note, and which guided me on how to proceed. Though it's a complex situation, knowing that researchers would expect transgender to be in his finding aid. The final example relates to missing LGBTQ data in legacy finding aids. The example I'm going to use is Polly Murray, who was a civil rights lawyer and Episcopal priest who lived from 1910 to 1985. Murray mostly had relationships with women, but did not call herself a lesbian. She was also gender nonconforming and preferred a masculine presentation. In fact, in the 1930s, she had inquired with doctors about taking male hormones, and their response was to suggest she take female hormones. Anyway, today, many scholars have defined Murray's gender identity as transgender, although that term was not available to her, and Murray may not have chosen it if it was. The collection was processed in 1992, and at the time, the archivist did not address Murray's gender nonconformity or Murray's early struggles with gender identity at all in the biographical note or anywhere else in the finding aid, although there is material in the collection related to this. The archivist just added that broad subject term, gender identity, as the only reference. So once again, this collection has been added to the LGBTQ research guide, but I mention this example of an older finding aid to illustrate the importance of prioritizing, going back and reevaluating description for what's missing and what could be updated. Being careful and thoughtful about adding any terms that the creator would not have used, or being sure to qualify why a term is being added. It potentially would be helpful for the archivist to explain in the finding aid any decisions related to why they added any terms.
Thank you.
We are currently looking into committing staff time to doing this type of legacy work. Although recognizing that the amount of staff time and resources to go back can be an overwhelming task for any institution, it's important to make that effort to determine how best to undo erasure and distortion of LGBTQ identities in archives.
Thank you, Laura. So we have a number of questions from the audience. I'm getting a little notice that we should probably open this up to conversation. So if you'd like to, I'll turn it over to Sonia, who will do that. And then also I want to apologize to the group. I need to leave around 12:25 to go teach an online course. So thank you so much, everyone in the conference, and to my co-panelists. Sonia, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say that in your general discussion, you've actually already answered a number of the audience questions. So I'm going to start with, there has been a request by Sophie to be told what the doggie's name is.
Sorry again about the dog. The mail carrier arrived. Her name is Ivy Luna, after Luna Lovegood in Harry Potter. So we're very nerdy at my house.
Thank you very much. I'm quite impressed with us that was the first animal that decided to be an audience member. So going on to the next audience question, and I'm combining some of these. So this is a question from Jules Thompson. Can you talk more about how your organizations practically navigate privacy concerns around historic LGBTQ plus materials? And then I am adding myself, how are you addressing digitization of a material where an individual other than the donor may be outed without their knowledge? This is open for anybody who'd like to answer it.
I guess I can answer that a little bit. The privacy question is it's actually something I think about a lot, because I think we at the History Project, we've been kind of pushed by like other archivists, people, kind of cultural heritage folks, and historians to kind of deal with this issue in a way that I think other people do not have to deal with, and somehow, in some sense, the expectation that LGBTQ stuff is somehow more sensitive and more private. And I think in some cases that can of course be true. Yet when you think about you know, you don't want to hurt people, you don't want to out people who you know, you don't want to hurt people. But also I think the way we kind of approach it is that this is, being queer is not a bad thing. It's like, it's not something to be ashamed of. I actually had a collection we digitized that was the AIDS obituary collection, and there was the idea that there were many obituaries where people did not die of AIDS-related illnesses at all, and we were urged to kind of redact those names so it didn't seem like they had died of AIDS. But we decided not to do that because for a lot of reasons. But one of them is that it's not shameful to have died of AIDS, and that if you read the obituary, you know, you can tell this person did not die of AIDS. So I think we take that kind of privacy and sensitivity very, very serious, but also honestly, like in the entire time I've been involved with the organization, we have not had a single person be like, hey, like, your collection outed me, or usually it's been that people have felt validated by being seen. With digital collections, I think we always include like takedown policies and stuff like that, but have never actually been contacted about that.
I think I'd add to that, which we have a few examples in our project. And again, it was a museum exhibit first. And Senator David Walsh, who actually was a Holy Cross graduate, was caught up in the 1940s, if any of you have read the recent book on Gay Brooklyn, in a controversy around a brothel in Brooklyn in the 1940s that was both was a site for both naval seamen to come to the brothel and also allegedly for Nazi spies. And so there was this big swastika swishery scandal playing out in the New York Post. And so what we chose to do there was just let the documents and let the history do the work. Walsh himself never identified as a member of the community, and we made that clear, but then we also allowed the more recent historians suggested conclusions that in fact he was a member of the community rest their intention. So you put those things together because that shows both the historiography of the change over time and the ways in which people have self-defined and the ways in which different kinds of materials make the record a fuller representation of a life. So we've just really tried to let the language do the work for us. We did the same thing. We had one oral history where the first Miss Gay Worcester, Rick Gusky, he preferred the term homosexual. And this was in an interview just last year. And it was just very interesting that was his preferred term. And so we let him name himself. For him, that had a kind of a scientific, medical heft that to him was important, that to other people might seem offensive or problematic. So we're just letting people label themselves or let the historical record represent where the person might have been at a given moment in an attempt to be respectful to people. But I would like to underscore Andrew's point about the privacy. It's important to be respectful of people's choices, but it's also important not to render through a kind of fetishization of the private to reinforce different kinds of hierarchical oppressions that exist within this labeling process.
And I also just wanted to mention, privacy concerns often are initiated by the donor creator themselves, whether for their personal records or third-party records within their collection. We'll redact if we have the time and staff to do it, or we'll use a condition of use form for materials that are going to be made available in the reading room. It does prevent us from digitizing a lot of LGBTQ collections if a big portion of the materials are closed. We have the papers of the International Foundation for Gender Education, and their membership records are really wonderful material filled with individuals writing in, talking about their experiences. It's great material for researchers, but the donor wanted it closed for a period of time, so we haven't So the rest of the collection is also not going to be digitized until everything can be made open. The newsletter I mentioned, By Women, the newsletter of the Boston Bisexual Women's Network, the donor's condition for giving us this newsletter was to digitize it and make it available online. But for the online version, she insisted that that we digitally redact proper names in it. So that was a huge task that staff took on. It took a lot of time and effort, but that was the only way we could digitize the material.
Thank you. This is a question for KJ. This is from Larissa Glasser. KJ, how do you think the so-called transgender tipping point, Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine, Caitlyn Jenner's public transition, has affected trans visibility and inclusion in the archives profession? Is there anything we can do better moving forward, especially for social justice for trans women of color who bear the brunt of structural injustice?
Yes, hi Larissa. I think that one of the great things to come out of the increased trans visibility is that more archival professionals are committed to collecting in this area. And there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. And it seems like once a week I'm finding out about important trans-related collections that are at archives that I'm like, great, we should be connecting with them. So that's a wonderful thing. I think what we now need to start doing more is being much more critical about the types of materials that are being collected and who they are representing and who they are not representing. And so I think in all of the ways that we see privileges surfacing in trans communities, we see that reflected in the archival record, right? So who has the ability to create historical materials about their lives? Who has the ability to preserve those, to then find an institutional home for those? What institutions want those materials, right? And so there are so many layers that function as barriers to representation in historical records. And a lot of the trans oral history projects have done a great job in trying to speak back against that and trying to fill that void where in particular trans women of color are not adequately represented for their contributions to communities, for their lives, right? And so we have an overrepresentation of otherwise privileged factions of trans communities. And so in this moment where trans visibility is ascending the interest in trans history, I think that we need to keep pushing and say, okay, well, what are we interested in? What are we collecting? And even things like pornographic materials, right? Like that has been an important part of trans historical representation. If archives are unwilling to collect those materials and put them in a critical context, then it's going to be kind of washing a really important part of this history. So there's a lot to be said there, but I think it's also an exciting moment.
Thank you. I just want to re-emphasize there's a lot of interest in metadata and language around describing LGBTQ plus collections. So I've been weeding through some of these, but I do have a non-metadata question. This is from Justin Snow. Do you have any way, and he does identify that it's mostly for Laura, but I believe everybody can answer it. Do you have any way to assess usage in research for collections using different terms, such as including trans heading versus not including the heading?
Short answer is no, I don't think so. But I'm probably not the right person to respond to that question. I can find out if there is a way, but I'm not aware of one.
Thank you. This is a question from Carissa Herzler. I'll go with Carissa. Regarding databases with established categories, how have you mapped metadata to be respectful to the LGBTQ community within established database categories? This is a question to the whole panel.
I'm not quite sure how to answer this one, but I will say that there are times when we ingest materials from our partners, and we do work in enhancing the metadata that's been provided. So there are some times when we see descriptions of photographs, for example, where we feel that those descriptions aren't really matching up, or they kind of overstep the boundaries of interpretation and what can actually be seen in the photograph. And so sometimes our role is to take a step back and say, I think these descriptions would be more accurate. And so I guess the answer to that for our context is that there are times in which we kind of norm some of the metadata in order to make sure that it aligns with our policies, but also our commitments, right? To making sure that, for example, I think an example will make this a little more specific, but if we have a photograph of a person who is called a crossdresser, well, how do you know that person is a crossdresser? Or how do you know that person is a transsexual? So if we don't have any other information about that individual, we might take a step back and describe that individual in broader ways, again, trying to describe the practice rather than the identity in order to fit with our collecting policy.
Yeah, I just want to say too, I mean, it can be a challenge for, you know, for individuals outside of the community who are processing and cataloging. There just needs to be more awareness, and I think we're not there yet.
I agree with that. And at the History Project, you know, we're you know, all volunteers really, and we do not require that people getting involved are, you know, professional archivists with years and years of experience describing collections. So we're dealing, you know, often say with young people who the idea of trans is something they might be very comfortable with, but who the idea of, you know, HIV and AIDS in the 80s is something that they can't wrap their heads around. So you have these like, I don't know, I think it requires a lot of attention, a lot of conversation. We're a very process heavy organization. We talk a lot about kind of what we do, and which is ultimately how we make those decisions. And it's being very, very careful as you move along. And yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. We do have one more question for KJ. If you can answer it in about 30 to 45 seconds, that'd be fantastic. So for KJ, since the archive does not collect from the 2000s, how do non-binary trans identities play a role in the collection and the metadata? You're muted. KJ, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Non-binary trans identities have always existed. So I think that for us, it's the same as any other identities in that we just try to pull in everything we can to represent that in the historical record and not overreach in the ways that we are describing those materials. So if a person is not self-identifying as something, we're not going to add that identity to that person. Yet you can find countless examples of people who we might surmise might now identify as non-binary, but who are kind of exhibiting non-binary gender expressions at much earlier times.
Thank you very much to panel B. Okay. We will now be breaking for lunch, or at least a break anyways. It'll be about 30 minutes and we will reconvene the conference at 1 p.m. Thank you everybody who presented this morning and to our audience. We hope to see you back at 1 p.m.